Hello.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hmm. I can't tell if I'm using which microphone I'm using. So, um, I think I set it to the correct one this time, though. So we're having a debate. I'm having a debate here on Twitter, and I actually like this because what's happening is I'm not used to debating about Bitcoin. So I want to make sure that I'm like not missing something. I'm not a Bitcoin expert. I don't know the white paper like that great. I just know that I studied algorithms, I studied math, and now I'm debating. I just don't see why BTC makes sense, and I can see why BSV makes sense, and I'm explaining why and stuff. And then Ghostbanned is saying, well, it's centralized, and I'm like, well, graph theory is the definition of decentralized that you want, at least in my opinion, is the graph theory definition, which is you don't want to be dependent on specific nodes and edges. You don't. It doesn't matter how spread out you are. But he was saying, okay, but it's the hash power. So he was basically saying, okay, but P has to be greater than Q in this part of the white paper. And I'm like, okay, that's finally someone is actually debating. They're not just throwing mud, they're actually debating the facts, which I'm happy about. Whether they're correct or they're not correct, they're actually debating the actual, facts and not just calling names and things like that, which I'm I respect. So that doesn't always happen with BTC people or even BSV people. So, we kind of throw mud at each other. But the fact that he's actually putting forth an argument that sounds like it's a logical argument, I can respect that. That's good. So the problem is that you don't need that assumption for Bitcoin to necessarily work as a whole. You just need that assumption to be true for the things that depend on that assumption to then be true. So if you have the longest chain, then the thing is you don't have to be worried about being spammed with a whole bunch of chains. That's the point. So he's saying, well, somebody can come up with a chain, but he was saying, quit saying invalid chain, invalid block, or whatever. He's saying somebody can spam you with valid blocks. But so then I was thinking, okay, so he's mentioning valid blocks, like technically valid, but they're not including a transaction or whatever. They're valid, but they're not containing like some transaction that they need to contain. So in a way, they're still invalid because they're not actually containing all the time-stamped data. In which I respond like, okay, um, the nodes are going to check, right? So if they're completely valid, not just according to some definition, but like completely valid as in they recognized all transactions, then it's not spam because it's actually the chain you want, because it's honest. So nobody's Sybil attacking or anything like that, right? So in some way it has to be invalid to even talk about this, because if it's not invalid, then it doesn't matter. That's the point. So it doesn't, at that point, we're not talking about centralization, because if we're assuming that somebody's attacking with valid blocks, that fine, attack with valid blocks that aren't rejecting any transactions, because that's how the system works, right? So I think he's assuming that some transactions are being ignored. And so therefore, like, oh, but we can't trust that system because then you put out a transaction and then our transactions are getting ignored, but they're still producing like technically valid blocks anyway. The problem with that is that if you have any nodes that you trust, or if you have honest nodes, basically, that recognize that transaction, that view it, they're going to distribute it to the rest of the network. They're going to announce it, and they will recognize when blocks are being made that are not accepting that transaction in that block. So they're going to see that that block doesn't have the transaction, and they're going to be like, well, that's not a valid block. And the thing is, it's not going to be, the spam can't last so long. Here's the thing. Even if you have a high hash rate and you're trying to make a long chain to spam the network, one of the things that I noted was all it takes is one, not even one node, but all it actually takes is one wallet, one SPV node, basically, to basically come up with a proof of either an invalid transaction, right? Or a transaction that existed and there's evidence that it was reported to the network. And so therefore it should exist in the block, in a particular block, but it doesn't. And they can report that. And I mean, it's hard to prove. I guess you can show, I'm not sure if you can easily show that a transaction doesn't exist in a block and show that like in not just constant time, but in like very small amount of time. In other words, not having to linearly check the entire block. Because if you can get a small proof, like a mathematical proof, basically, that a block is invalid, then all you have to do is share that around with everyone. And all the nodes will instantly be able to check the hash of, that block. And then they can ignore all the chains built on that. So if you have a spam longest chain with a lot of hash power behind it trying to build this thing up, all it takes is one finding out of a block that's invalid and then being able to distribute that proof. And basically, the network can recognize that it's an invalid longest chain and not to have to go and process all of it. Now, he might have a good point if we're talking about they're making a whole bunch of pseudo transactions, right? And then they're ignoring a transaction. How do the honest nodes know that somebody was properly sending out that information? I guess that's a valid question. Like, maybe that's part of how the network needs to work. When you don't have the maximum hash power in the competition, you have to take advantage of the fact that you can connect to multiple nodes, I guess. And you can say, hey, did you hear about this transaction? Did you hear about this transaction? Did you hear about this transaction? Because they're not going to like, the spam network is going to have to actually generate valid blocks that contain all the time-stamped transactions, including the spam ones that they're supposedly generating that are supposedly spam. But the honest nodes they'll have to take all those spam transactions as well and deal with them and whatever fees that that come with those. But yeah, like this is a good debate to have, because people are questioning. But yeah, it's true that you can't just logically say, so it's a fallacy to say, well, the white paper says P has to be greater than Q, blah, end of story. But in reality, it says P has to be greater than Q for these conclusions to hold, not just in general for everything to work. So for those particular conclusions to hold, yeah, P has to be greater than Q. And that's also interesting to look at as an inductive statement, because if you're able to keep getting rid of a longest spamming block, then it seems like that would still work. But that's a good question, because I don't know. I don't even know, like, I'm not an expert on how all these things work, basically. So I don't know, for example, like, I don't know how it works when you're offering fees to the nodes and saying, can you do this transaction? And I'm going to pay this much. And either they accept it or they don't. Because you can pay a certain amount and then the blocks, the nodes that accept it will get the reward. So I guess they're not going to earn money, I suppose, if they're using their own wallets that they already own to then pay themselves on the node side. If, they're not going to be making money, I guess, that way, because they have to expend proof of work in order to do that, which is fine even if they're trying to spam the network, maybe, because the only way they're going to actually properly spam the network is if somehow they convince the honest nodes, because you really have to convince the honest nodes, right? Because if you're using a wallet, ultimately you're going to be wanting to communicate with nodes that are responding to your transactions. So when you receive coins or when you send coins, the nodes have to respond to your transactions or you're going to communicate with a different node. So that's number one. And also you're paying to get your transaction sent. So either they're going to listen to it and get paid or they're not. So you're going to be incentivized to try to connect to a node that's going to listen to you. So if a node listens to you, it's going to probably not want to be, it's probably going to be incentivized to notify all the other nodes, all the other honest nodes at least, that there's a transaction that's being ignored. So it might see that there's a longest chain somewhere, but since it's an honest node, it can basically try to compile together this proof that says, hey, look, this is a long chain and all the transactions in it are valid, but it seems like they're censoring or they're not taking into account this transaction right here that's should be timestamped in this earlier block. And if they can show that and kind of distribute that information to the rest of the nodes, then I think what would happen is at least the honest nodes, they might not have the hash power to just start making a chain that's longer per se, but they will be able to say, well, we're going to ignore that chain that was already built, that's long, right? They'll be able to identify it. And then from that point on, they can say, well, we're just choosing to ignore that. So they can build on it if they want. I mean, it's their choice. Nobody obviously is going to stop you from building a longest chain if you have more hash power. And to try to add, for example, valid blocks, all validly signed signatures on it. The issue is that the honest nodes are gonna probably, and I don't know how this exactly works, but I'd assume, based on my intuition, my knowledge of algorithms, I would assume that the honest nodes would basically, like I said, they would compile together the most efficient way, like the most efficient kind of piece of data that they can announce. That would the most efficient way to prove that a block is ignoring a transaction. It should be invalid because it's ignoring these transactions. And if they announce that soon enough and they get a timestamp or whatever to prove that they're announcing it, then I think the other honest nodes in the network would, at that point, they would switch because they would say, hey, these are all valid signed digital signatures. We got to go with that one. And it doesn't mean that they have to ignore the spam, all the wallets that are trying to support the spamming. They don't have to ignore those transactions because they'll see those transactions one way or another. I don't know if they would see them per se, like in a block or something after the block is created. So that's kind of weird because, like, I guess you could argue that the spam network could hide their wallet transactions and only tell it to their own nodes, keep them secret, and then build like blocks based on that, and thus make it appear as though the honest nodes are rejecting those transactions. But if you announce, see, every node, the thing is, if you announce a transaction, you can announce it anywhere. So a node has proof that its own of basically every node, I guess, has proof of whether it received notification of a transaction or not. So if say there's a node, I suppose an honest node, what it could do is it could ask the question, why? Well, if why did you make a block here, but you never told me about that transaction? And so basically an honest node can say, hey, you never told me about the transaction. I can't prove that you didn't tell me, to the other node that's building these blocks to form the longest chain. I can't prove that you didn't tell me about the transaction, but here's the thing. I don't think the honest node would actually have to prove it because, and here's why, because the other honest nodes would already know as well. They would already be thinking the same thing. And if they were told about the transaction, then they would send it to this node as well. So see, that's why they're incentivized to kind of double check everything with each other and be like, well, why am I getting this transaction? But, but he's not, why am I not seeing these transactions that are showing up in these blocks? So you like a spam node could try to act like that too, right? They could try to spoof and say, well, I never got this transaction. But the honest nodes will know that they saw it and that they're announcing it to everyone. So it is a very interesting case. Like when this assumption that, P is greater than Q is not held, it sounds like a very interesting case. I don't know how it all works, not being a Bitcoin developer, not having a mining pool, not having all those things, but just trying to think about how the network works. If you don't have the highest hash power, very interesting to think about how that actually works. Because I think the nodes, for the most part, from what I understand, they always have to go off, and this is the reason why these are the types of reasons. For example, like why they would go when the same coin is signed twice to do two different places. This is the reason why they might announce it as a double spend, but they'll just go with the first one that they saw instead of blocking that address or that account. Why would they not block it? It's because the reasoning is because otherwise there could be a malicious node that you report a valid transaction to, but it never announces it. And then for some reason, after a while, Wallet might say, hey, why were these coins never spent? Well, let me spend them somewhere else then, because this, they never were used, and then as soon as they're spent somewhere else, then the node finally announces both, right? Or, and they try to do that maliciously. So like, I guess malicious nodes can do all sorts of things. They can make multiple nodes and multiple wallets at any time they want to try to spoof anything they want. So the easiest thing to do for the honest nodes, I think, you go with the first transactions that you view. And I think that they question, as soon as they see any blocks being produced that do not have that have transactions that they've never seen before, they immediately question the validity of that, and maybe just try to avoid. Maybe they decide to avoid building on that chain, because if you never saw a transaction, why did you never see it? The spam network will, because if you're not allowed to do that. If you're not allowed to do that, then you have no way. The spam nodes, in theory, they should be able to just generate all these transactions to only each other and not announce it until they form a block, and then try to use that as proof that they're being ignored, that they have valid transactions that are being ignored. And that's fundamentally that should not work at all. Should not work, right? But I think the reason why it won't work is because the honest nodes know that could happen, right? They know that they know that they should just go with the transactions that they see first, and that the other honest nodes are going to be doing that, and ultimately only the honest chain is going to be valuable. Not necessarily just longest chain, but like the honest chain is the only one that's ultimately going to be valuable in the long run, because ultimately you can try to make a long spam chain, but if nobody values it now because they know they have some proof, they have evidence that it's not honest, that it's rejecting certain transactions, they're not going to want to go with it. So now it comes down to, well, are they rejecting certain transactions? Well, if your own wallet transactions are rejected. So that's number one. But if it's somebody else's wallet, you don't know if it's a spam wallet that's created for that purpose or if it's a genuine one. But I think what you can do is, like, one thing an SPV node probably can do is they probably can check to see that they've seen certain things. So, for example, you can have a list of transactions that you've seen, and you can try to build like a Merkle. You can have like a time. You can use hashes to keep track of like time, to keep track of the fact that you've seen all this information, and then you might not store them all, but you can go back and you can see that, does all this information match your end hash? Because if somebody's trying to build into blocks transactions that they didn't announce to all the nodes, it doesn't sound like something they should be able to get away with. Because that would like basically confuse the network at that point. I mean, these are good questions, and this is why I like debating with these people, because when somebody actually wants to debate and find out what the truth is, then that's where we're actually going to get somewhere and figure something out. If we're not properly debating about what's true and we're just throwing mud or whatever, making fun of each other, which is fun sometimes, but honestly, it's hard to find somebody who's going to debate. It's hard to find somebody who will actually take you seriously and be like, oh, this guy's actually serious. He actually has a valid point. He might not be correct, but he actually has a point that he believes. Let me prove that point wrong, or let me explain why it's not true. That's cool. I'm fine with that. That's what we need. If we don't do that, we're not going to figure out, we're not going to convince anyone one way or the other anyway. And people aren't going to understand why their network is going to have problems. It looks like I don't have anyone following this stream right now, so yeah, I might have to just stop this live stream. But yeah, this has been kind of cool. So I'll see you guys later. Keep up on this Ghostbanned with me, because this is an interesting debate. Let's not fight or anything over, making fun of anyone and saying, well, BTC it's just a scam. And we're going to argue the real facts and get down to business. Whoever is there, hi. Nobody's chatted from what I've seen. So get on Twitter, guys. Get on the debate that we're having. We're having a debate. All right, I'll see you.